Welcome to Live with the Author. I'm Amanda Goodwin, and I'm one of the editors of Reading Research Quarterly. I'm also an associate professor at Vanderbilt University, and I have today with us some of our wonderful special issue authors. Welcome, Peng Peng and Marc.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me, and I'm excited to hear you talk about your manuscript. The first thing I'm always wondering is, how did you guys get interested in this topic?
And hi, I'm Peng Peng. Thanks for inviting us for this interview, Amanda. So I'm currently assistant professor from the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas, Austin. My research focused on cognitive mechanism underlying various learning disabilities. And I'm especially interested in embedding high-level cognitive skills training into academic instruction for children with severe learning difficulties. And this paper published in RQ is actually one important theoretical part of my current research project.
So it kind of came from seeing a need, it sounds like, and then your research sees that there's these kids that are having serious challenges.
Yeah.
And thinking about this area as a way to serve these kids with serious challenges. Cool. How about you, Marc?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. So for people who might not know me, my name is Marc Goodrich. I'm assistant professor in special ed at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And the way I got interested in reading research and education research actually sort of goes all the way back to high school when I took a AP psychology class. And like that just spurred my interest in psychology in general. And then in college, I learned that a lot of developmental psychologists and developmental scientists do research on how children learn and acquire reading skills or acquire other academic skills. And really what sparked my interest and motivation to actually pursue that area was learning about achievement gaps. And thinking, well, this is a really important area to how can we promote successful acquisition of academic skills for all children, regardless of their backgrounds. And that really, pushed me towards this field.
Well, that was one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your guys' article, was that you're talking broadly about what we can do to support students, but you're also talking about, like, sometimes there's students who don't respond to our current instruction, and we may need to think about it in a different way.
Yeah. So, our article does take a little different approach to addressing the reading needs, especially among the struggling readers. Because in our opinion, like, the science of reading is to investigate and understand how reading develops and how reading is taught. So for my research, I'm especially interested in the cognition role in reading development. And that's why we think, in our article, we try to emphasize that cognition may play a very important role in understanding how students learn to read, especially for those who struggle to read all the time, and how we can embed cognitive process into reading instruction to help those kids. Yeah.
So I think that that's a great segue to one of my interests. So, we have this science of reading, and you mentioned that you felt like it was, I think, this kind of body of how reading develops and the instruction.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So how does your paper add to the science of reading, add this body of knowledge?
Well, I guess since Peng Peng tackled the last one, I'll step in here. I think that our paper sort of provides a framework for thinking about, well, what can we do as a field moving forward with trying to address, instruction for these students who maybe aren't responding to what we already know of as evidence-based instruction. And so what I think that we're trying to highlight here is that, well, one, we do need to provide some supports for these students who are non-responsive and try and figure out what can we do differently to help them. But we also don't want to try to necessarily reinvent the wheel, right? The science of reading and reading research has a long history of showing us like what works for teaching students to read. And there's, in the past couple of decades, there have been these training studies on training cognitive skills, and we see that it doesn't improve reading when you just train those cognitive skills. So we don't want to move away from evidence-based reading instruction. We want to think about, well, how can we embed other supports into what we know as evidence-based reading and instruction that maybe will enhance its effectiveness, especially for those students who might otherwise be non-responsive.
So I love that. And I think an example would be really helpful for those listening in. So when you're saying like teaching cognitive skills separately versus embedding cognitive skills within reading instruction, can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Absolutely, yes. So, there are sort of these like commercially available brain training programs out there like CogMed and things like that, that might have kids or adults or whoever's doing them, for that matter, play memory games or something, right?
Just for building
And
memory.
exactly right, to train that memory and working memory, because we know the evidence shows that that's correlated with like academic achievement. But the evidence shows is that people do get really good at those specific kinds of memory games and problems that they practice on, but then that doesn't result in effects on reading. And so in like a recent pilot study that Peng Peng and I did, we took an early literacy curriculum for preschoolers. And so it involved like rhyming games and things like that to build phonological awareness. And so we would play these different rhyming games that had picture cards where kids have a picture of a dog, and then they have to decide, okay, well, does frog rhyme with dog, right? And so they have to say yes, and then we reinforce that or provide feedback if they're incorrect. But then we'll flip that card with a frog on it over and do another one. So now does dog rhyme with cat, right? So they have to answer that, and then we flip that cat over. And then we ask them to hold those words in memory, right? Hold frog in memory and hold cat in memory while they're still continuing to do that phonological awareness rhyming game. And then at the end, they have to recall all of the words that they went through from memory. So they're working on training memory while at the same time engaging in what we know to be evidence-based early literacy instruction.
Yeah.
That's a great example.
Yeah. So, and Marc just gave a very good example. One of the example we designed called working memory embedded reading tasks. So I think our design of this cognitive support training different from previous CogMed or general working memory training is we considered working memory as part of the domain-specific reading skills or process. Previous studies show that domain general working memory training based on like academic irrelevant materials does not really produce effects on academic performance, but they do have near transfer effects on working memory structurally similar tasks. So we thought like maybe just we have so many reading tasks that has a working memory component in it, right? So we just think of maybe by embedding working memory into those working memory demanding reading tasks. And in this way, we can really produce not only improvements on reading instruction, but can also reading performance, but also can help the kids better use their working memory in those reading tasks. Kind of hope like produce synergistic effects. So in this way, our way of training is we call domain-specific working memory training model.
Right, kind of reading specific working memory.
Yes,
It's a fascinating idea. So what do teachers do with this information? What should teachers do tomorrow based off of, kind of the initial evidence that you guys provided and this model?
So, I mean, our model, we call the cognitive element in model reading instruction have like 4 components, right? Like the first 2 is code and meaning focused explicit reading instruction. The third one is embedded working memory instruction. And 4th one is providing cognitive strategy during this embedded working memory training. So based on this model, we think teachers should definitely adopt the explicit reading instruction on both code and the meaning skills even very early on, right? And teacher can also build, cognitive support into reading instructions, such as teaching, like Marc just illustrated, like teaching some strategies, memory in mnemonics to help the kids remember words, remember the main idea of the passages. So I think that's kind of a takeaway message for teachers if they want to do something based on our model in their instruction.
One thing I was wondering, just based off your premise that some kids don't respond to certain instruction, do I as a teacher work on this with all my students? Or do I prioritize this for kids who, say, are having working memory challenges or kids who aren't responding to the evidence-based instruction?
That's a great question. So the model that we have developed and the way we've done it so far, it sort of requires like an intensive one-on-one focus because we're practicing those working memory skills like at the child's sort of instructional level for working memory, for lack of a better term, right? So we don't want to ask the child to try to hold 5 words in memory while they're doing this other task if that's well beyond what they're capable of, if they're if they only appear to be capable of holding 3 of the words in memory, right? So we try to practice like at the level the child's capable at, and then move forward from there as they get better at using strategies to help assist with working memory. So I think that this approach, while I want to stress that we need more evidence behind it, it seems like it's probably an approach that's better for the students who do have that specific weakness in working memory. But of course, there's also just the general code and meaning focused reading instruction aspects of the model as well that should be relevant for all students.
Very cool. So what does your study, your theory, your model say for principals and policymakers?
Wow. Our model is like, we do have, in our paper, we do review some studies that kind of provide supporting evidence to our model, but like Marc said, our model is like, still need a lot of evidence, right, to back up the validity of it. So at this stage, I would say like, since our model emphasizes explicit reading instruction, so I would say for principals and policymakers, maybe, they should, right, like at this point, they should, should adopt a fundamental principle, explicit instruction, for reading instruction at their schools. And I think that's the message I can, I say our paper can provide for principals and policymakers.
Yeah, it's an important message there. Sorry, Marc, you were going to say something?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to just sort of reiterate that and say, I think that the message I would want to provide for principals or policymakers, especially a principal who's trying to will say, what reading curriculum should I adopt for our school? Or, we've got these struggling students. What do we do for them? I want to get back to the idea of not necessarily reinventing the wheel here, right? It's more about taking evidence-based instruction that we know works and figuring out how to make more minor adjustments to that to support the students who are non-responsive.
And I think the other thing I hear you saying too is that we know some things about this don't work, like AKA general working memory or general cognitive skill training you can't expect it to link to reading. And so if you're going to be working on these things, really linking to that evidence-based reading instruction as a way of integrating cognitive skill training.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So what do you say are there any connections for parents that you guys have?
So I think that parents should like do activities with children to build their code level or comprehension skills, such as like, do shared reading, to help kids accumulate knowledge in certain topic. And also like the way we design the working memory embedded reading activities had a lot of like fun memory parts in it. So those memory parts, like, we think if you combine that with reading materials, it would be very interesting for parents to do with the kids, such as, Marc says, card flip to remember the word, the sounds. I think that would be another, recommendation for parents to do with their kids.
Well, it seems like there's some really important connections for researchers. How do researchers take your model or your findings, your initial evidence, and run with it?
Well, I think that's what we need to happen, hopefully, is we need people to explore this, right? We've done some preliminary testing with, we did our pilot study with preschoolers who were dual language learners. But we need to figure out, okay, well, is this a promising approach? Does preliminary evidence suggest that this works? And, our preliminary studies suggest that it does, but it's with a narrow age group and a specific population. And so we need more investigations across a broader age span. And, maybe with, monolingual students or with students who are diagnosed with learning disabilities, right? But are still non-responsive to, the tiered instruction that they're receiving based on that. And so we need studies that target different components of reading, and we need studies that target different populations to really figure out, okay, is this an approach that works? And if so, who does it work for, under what circumstances does it work?
That sounds so important. So this is all fascinating. It's kind of a different way of thinking about reading. I mean, I've definitely thought about cognition and reading, but the idea of integrating these things into reading practices is really interesting. So moving forward, what are some takeaway messages that you think we should really make sure that we understand?
Well, I think a key takeaway is that, it's important that we explore possibilities for enhancing instruction or academic outcomes for all students, right? Even the students with severe learning difficulties. And, but again, this is sort of a theoretical framework, right? It's not a rigorously tested model. And so I think that has to be within those key takeaways as well, is that when we're thinking about embedding cognition, we need to not just assume that it's going to work. And we need to come at it from a very rigorous scientific perspective to try and evaluate, does this approach work? And does this approach hold promise?
Yeah, that seems to be the key, right? When we're pushing the science of reading forward, we really want to remind everybody that part of pushing it forward is that rigor. And so what I hear you saying is that when we come up with these models that are important, are pushing things, and that we have initial evidence for, the next step is to get a full range of evidence and to understand for whom it works, under what conditions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. And I'm looking forward to thinking about this further. And I really learned a lot. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.